Good evening and welcome to the Sleep to Lore series. Tonight we follow Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger and tormented protagonist of Stephen King's Dark Tower saga. As you settle in, let your shoulders drop and allow the night's quiet weight to anchor you. Take a long, slow breath, letting go of today and surrender to the dark. If these tales bring you peace, please consider subscribing so we can continue resting together. Chapter 1. The End of Innocence. Childhood in Gilead. Midworld is a place that has moved on. Before we look at the broken man wandering the endless desert, we have to start at the beginning. We have to look at the boy before the world broke him. Long before the dust and the blood, there was a kingdom called Gilead. Imagine a city of high stone walls, towering spires, and banners flapping in a clean, crisp wind. Gilead was the heart of the affiliation, a bastion of light and order in a world that was slowly beginning to rot from the edges inward. The air here smelled different than it did anywhere else. It carried the scent of ancient, cool stone, rain-washed cobblestones, and the sweet, heavy fragrance of sandalwood. It was a place of high fantasy, rooted in chivalry and strict, unyielding duty. At the center of this world was a boy named Roland Deschain. Roland was not just any boy. He was the son of Stephen Deschain, the leader of the gunslingers. In our world, a gunslinger might just be a cowboy with a quick draw. But in Midworld, a gunslinger was a knight. They were the ultimate peacekeepers, the diplomats, and the executioners. They traced their lineage directly back to Arthur Eld, the Midworld equivalent of King Arthur. The guns they carried were not mere weapons. They were holy relics. Legend said that Arthur Eld's legendary sword, Excalibur, was melted down to forge the giant, heavy, sandalwood-gripped revolvers that the gunslingers wore on their hips. From the moment Roland took his first breath, he carried the crushing weight of this legacy. The stone halls of his family's castle echoed with the ghosts of his ancestors. He grew up knowing that he was meant to lead, meant to protect, and meant to hold the line against the encroaching darkness. There was no room for a normal childhood, no room for softness. You could smell the ozone lingering in the training yards, a sharp, metallic scent that always followed the discharge of firearms. You could hear the constant rhythmic thud of boots on hard dirt, the clash of wooden practice swords, and the harsh, booming voice of their teacher, Court. Court was a mountain of a man, scarred and weathered, smelling of old leather, sweat, and chewing tobacco. He wielded a thick ironwood staff that seemed to have a life of its own. He did not teach the boys through gentle encouragement. He taught them through pain, bruises, and broken bones. If a boy made a mistake, Court's staff would strike fast and hard, leaving a deep, throbbing ache that lasted for weeks. Court believed that pain was the only teacher that never lied. Roland and his closest friends, Cuthbert Allgood and Alain Johns, spent their days in this grueling cycle. They learned how to shoot, how to fight, how to track, and how to think. They learned that a gunslinger does not shoot with his hand, he shoots with his mind. He does not kill with his gun, he kills with his heart. But even with the harsh training, Roland still had pieces of his innocence intact. He still loved his friends. He still found comfort in the warm, bustling kitchens of the castle. He still looked at the adults around him with a sense of trust. That trust was the first thing the world decided to strip away from him. The turning point in Roland's young life did not involve a monster or a dark sorcerer. It involved a man he knew and cared for. It involved the castle cook, a large, jovial man named Hax. For years, Hax was a source of warmth in the cold, strict environment of Gilead. The kitchens were a sanctuary. They smelled of roasting meats, fresh bread baking in the stone ovens, and rich, savory gravies. Hax would often slip the boys extra treats, a piece of pie or a warm roll, when Court had starved them as punishment. To young Roland, hacks represented kindness. He represented the simple, good things in life that did not involve guns, duty, or pain. But Midworld was changing. A rebel named John Farson, known as the Good Man, was gathering forces in the Outer Baronies. Farson wanted to tear down the affiliation, to destroy Gilead, and to plunge the world into chaos. His influence was like a slow-acting poison, seeping into the minds of ordinary people. One evening, Roland and Cuthbert were sneaking through the darkened halls of the castle, heading toward the kitchen for a late-night snack. The stone floors were freezing against their bare feet. The shadows flickered long and distorted on the walls from the dim torchlight. As they approached the kitchen, they heard hushed voices. They crept closer, pressing themselves against the cold stone wall, hiding in the darkness. Through a crack in the heavy wooden door, they saw Hacks. But he was not baking bread. He was talking to a guard, and the tone of his voice made Roland's stomach twist into a tight knot. Hacks was conspiring with the guard. He was talking about John Farson. Worse, he was talking about a plan to poison the meat going to a nearby town called Taunton. He was actually doing this to halt the town's furnaces that supplied weapons to the affiliation. Later, right before he was hanged, Hacks refused to repent, coldly stating he would rather the children die than live under the rule of the gunslingers. Roland stood in the dark, barely breathing. The smell of the kitchen, the lingering scent of roasted garlic and sweet dough, suddenly made him feel sick. The warmth of the ovens felt oppressive, suffocating. The man who had shown them so much kindness was plotting the mass murder of children. Roland faced his first true gunslinger's choice. He was just a boy, but the code of Arthur Eld was already hardwired into his brain. He and Cuthbert retreated into the shadows, their bare feet silent on the stone. They went straight to Roland's father, Stephen Deschain. Stephen did not hesitate. The treason was confirmed, and the sentence was death. The execution took place on Gallows Hill. The sky was an overcast, bruised grey. The wind whipped across the hill, biting and cold, carrying the dry scent of dead leaves. The entire castle staff and the gunslinger apprentices were ordered to watch. Roland stood in the front row, his hands resting by his sides, his face an emotionless mask. He watched as the guards led Hacks up the wooden steps of the gallows. The wood groaned under their weight. Hacks looked out at the crowd, his eyes eventually finding Roland. There was no hatred in the cook's eyes, only a deep, profound sadness. The executioner slipped the rough hemp rope around Hacks's neck. The sound of the thick fibers tightening was loud in the absolute silence of the crowd. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor banged open with a loud wooden crack. Hacks dropped. The rope pulled taut with a sickening thud. The cook's body swung back and forth, the rope creaking in the cold wind. Roland did not look away. He forced himself to watch the lifeless body sway. The smell of the cold wind, the sound of the creaking rope, the sight of his friend hanging by the neck, it all etched itself permanently into his mind. He realized then that kindness could be a mask for evil. He realized that duty required a cold, heavy heart. He had done the right thing, the necessary thing, but he felt a piece of his childhood die on those wooden gallows. The hanging of Hacks was a deep wound, but the true fatal blow to Roland's innocence came from within his own family. Stephen Deschain was a great man, a strong leader, and a deadly fighter. But he was also deeply burdened by the collapsing state of the world. He spent his days managing the political unrest, trying to hold the crumbling affiliation together. His attention was constantly drawn outward, toward the threat of John Farson and the unrest in the Outer Baronies. Because his eyes were fixed on the horizon, he failed to see the rot spreading inside his own home. Enter Martin Broadcloak. Martin was Stephen's chief advisor, a court magician of immense power and dark influence. Martin was not just a man, he was a guise of Walter Paddock, the Man in Black, a servant of the cosmic evil known as the Crimson King. But in Gilead, he played the role of the loyal advisor. Whenever Martin walked into a room, the atmosphere changed. The temperature seemed to drop. The shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, clinging to his dark, flowing robes. He brought with him a smell that Roland despised, a sharp, metallic scent, like copper left out in the rain, mixed with a faint, unnatural sweetness. It was the smell of dark magic, of something fundamentally wrong with the universe. Roland hated Martin. He hated the way the magician smiled, a thin, knowing smirk that suggested he knew everybody's darkest secrets. He hated the way Martin looked at him, like Roland was a chess piece on a board, a tool waiting to be used. But what Roland hated most was the way Martin looked at his mother. Gabrielle Deschain was a woman of incredible beauty and grace. She was loved by the people of Gilead, known for her gentle demeanor and her elegant presence. She smelled of a specific, delicate perfume, sweet summer roses and light citrus. To Roland, she was the epitome of warmth and safety. She used to sing him to sleep with old nursery rhymes, her voice soft and soothing in the quiet of the night. But as Stephen grew more distant, consumed by his duties as Din, Gabrielle grew lonely. Martin saw this vulnerability and exploited it. He used his charm, his manipulative words, and perhaps a touch of his dark magic to seduce the king's wife. The affair went on for months. It was a poorly kept secret among the adults in the castle, a quiet shame that no one dared to speak aloud. Stephen knew about it, but his political position and his focus on the coming war kept him from acting rashly. Roland, however, did not know. Not until Martin decided it was time for him to know. Martin did not just want to sleep with the king's wife. He wanted to destroy the king's heir. He wanted to break Roland's mind, to push the boy into doing something reckless and suicidal. One afternoon, the castle was quiet. The sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the high, stained-glass windows. Roland was walking down the long corridor leading to his mother's chambers. He wanted to see her, perhaps to find some comfort, to smell the sweet scent of her perfume and forget the harsh lessons of court's training yard. As he neared her door, the air grew thick. The golden sunlight seemed to dull. Then he smelled it. The delicate, sweet scent of his mother's rose perfume was completely overpowered by the sharp, metallic, coppery stench of Martin's dark magic. The two smells clashed in the air, creating a nauseating, suffocating aroma. The door to her chambers was slightly ajar. Martin had left it open on purpose. Roland pushed the heavy wooden door. It swung open on silent hinges. He stepped into the room, and the world simply stopped. The sound of his own breathing faded away. The beating of his heart slowed to a heavy, agonizing crawl. There, in the center of the room, on the large canopy bed, he saw them. He saw his mother, the woman who sang him to sleep, entangled with the dark sorcerer. The visual was a physical blow to his chest. Martin looked up from the bed. He did not look surprised. He looked directly into Roland's eyes, and he smiled. It was a cold, victorious smile. Roland stumbled backward. He could not breathe. His chest felt like it was wrapped in tight iron bands. The sweet smell of the perfume and the harsh metallic stench of the magic filled his lungs, choking him. He turned and ran. He ran blindly through the stone corridors, the sound of his boots echoing loudly, mimicking the frantic pounding of his heart. His mind fractured. The mother he loved was a traitor. The man who advised his father was a monster. His home was tainted, poisoned from the inside out. He felt a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a hot, blinding fire that burned away the last remnants of the boy he was. He could not kill his mother. He could not kill Martin. The sorcerer was too powerful, and striking him down would cause a political collapse that would destroy his father. But the rage needed an outlet. The code of the gunslinger demanded action. He could not sit idle while his honor and his father's honor were dragged through the mud. Martin had planned this perfectly. He knew that the only way Roland could claim his guns and demand justice was to prove himself a man. To do that, Roland had to take his rite of passage. He had to challenge his teacher, Court, to a duel. Normally, apprentices waited until they were much older, stronger, and more experienced before challenging Court. To challenge Court and lose meant exile. You were stripped of your rank, stripped of your name, and sent out into the wasteland to die as a commoner. Martin wanted Roland to challenge Court early. He wanted Court to break the boy, to beat him to a pulp, and send him away in disgrace. With the heir gone, Gilead would fall even faster. But Martin underestimated the sheer, terrifying depth of Roland's will. Roland did not hesitate. Still burning with the sight of the betrayal, he marched straight to the training yards. The yard was empty, dusty, and bathed in the orange light of the late afternoon sun. The smell of dry earth and old sweat hung heavily in the air. Court was sitting on a wooden bench carving a piece of wood with a sharp knife. He looked up as the 14-year-old boy approached. Court saw the look in Roland's eyes. He saw the cold, dead stare that had replaced the boyish innocence. He knew immediately what had happened, and he knew what Roland was going to do. "You are not ready, maggot," Court grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. "I claim my right," Roland said, his voice flat, emotionless. The words hung in the dusty air, heavy and irreversible. By the ancient laws of Arthur Eld, Court could not refuse. If an apprentice claimed the right to the test, the teacher had to fight him. The rules were simple. The apprentice had to state his weapon. They would fight in the yard. If the boy could lay hands on Court's weapon and defeat him, he earned his guns. If the boy failed, he was cast out forever. Court stood up, his massive frame blocking out the sun. He picked up his ironwood staff. The wood was dark, polished smooth by years of use, and stained with the blood of previous challengers. "Choose your weapon," Court demanded. Roland could have chosen a wooden sword, a quarterstaff, or his bare hands. But Roland was not thinking like a boy anymore. He was thinking like a killer. He remembered the lessons Court had drilled into his skull. You use whatever you have to win. You pay no coinage to fairness. "I choose David," Roland said. Court's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. It was the closest the old man had ever come to showing shock. David was a hawk. Weeks earlier, the boys had been tasked with capturing and taming wild birds of prey. Roland had captured a fierce, large hawk and named him David after the biblical story of the small boy who slew the giant. David was not just a pet. He was a violent, wild predator. He smelled of raw meat, dusty feathers, and feral aggression. Roland had spent hours training him, letting the bird's sharp talons dig into the thick leather gauntlet on his arm, learning to command the creature's violent instincts. Court laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "A bird. You bring a bird against my staff. You are a fool, boy. But it is your choice." Roland walked to the mews and retrieved David. He secured the leather hood over the bird's eyes to keep him calm. The hawk was heavy on his arm, its talons gripping the thick leather of his gauntlet. He walked back out into the yard. The tension in the air was suffocating. The orange light of the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the dirt. The only sound was the dry wind rustling the leaves of the ancient trees lining the courtyard. Roland stood 20 paces from Court. He removed the leather hood from David's head. The hawk blinked, its sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the yard. "Begin!" Court roared, and he charged. Court moved with terrifying speed for a man his size. The ironwood staff swung in a deadly, whistling arc aimed directly at Roland's ribs. If it connected, it would shatter his bones instantly. Roland did not try to block the staff. He dodged, throwing his body into the dry dirt, feeling the heavy rush of wind as the heavy wood passed inches over his back. He rolled, tasting the grit and dust in his mouth, and sprang to his feet. Court spun, bringing the staff around in a backhand swing. The thick wood slammed into Roland's shoulder. The sound of the impact was a sickening, meaty thud. Pain exploded down Roland's arm, hot and blinding. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming. Court did not let up. He advanced, his face twisted into a mask of pure, violent fury. "You die a beggar, boy," he spat, raising the staff for a crushing downward blow. Roland knew he could not beat Court in a physical fight. The man was too strong, too experienced. He needed an opening. He needed a distraction. As the staff came down, Roland thrust his arm forward. He did not throw the hawk. He simply released his grip and shouted the command. David launched himself from Roland's arm. The hawk did not fly away. It flew straight at Court's face. The bird hit the large man with the force of a thrown rock. Court yelled in surprise and pain as David's razor-sharp talons dug into his forehead and cheeks. The hawk's wings beat frantically, a flurry of brown feathers and violent motion. David's beak tore into Court's skin, seeking the soft flesh of his eyes. For the first time in his life, Court lost his focus. He dropped one hand from the staff, desperately trying to tear the frantic, tearing bird away from his face. Blood poured down Court's cheeks, mixing with the sweat and dirt, smelling of hot copper and rust. This was the opening Roland needed. Ignoring the agonizing pain in his shoulder, Roland lunged forward. He didn't reach for Court's chest or throat. He reached for the weapon, his hands clamped around the smooth, heavy wood of the ironwood staff. Court roared, realizing his mistake. He tried to yank the staff back, but Roland held on with a desperate, manic grip. The boy's knuckles turned white. His muscles strained to the point of tearing. Court finally managed to grab David with his massive hand. He squeezed, crushing the bird's hollow bones. The hawk let out a sharp, piercing shriek. Court ripped the bird from his face and threw the broken, bleeding body into the dust. David lay on the dirt, his wings twitching, his life fading. Roland saw the blood seeping into the dry earth. He saw the first thing he truly loved, die for his cause. The sight did not make him falter. It fueled his rage. With a violent, twisting motion, he used Court's own momentum against him. He claimed the staff from the old man's grip, securing his victory as he delivered a final, brutal kick. His boot connected with the side of Court's temple. There was a loud, sharp crack. Court groaned, a deep, guttural sound, and fell to the ground. Silence crashed down on the courtyard. The dust settled, swirling slowly in the fading light. The metallic smell of blood hung heavy in the air. Court lay on the ground, his face a torn, bleeding mess. He looked up at the boy standing over him. Roland stood perfectly still, breathing heavily. He held the ironwood staff in his hands. His shoulder was throbbing, his clothes were covered in dirt, and his eyes were completely dead. He looked at the broken body of David the hawk. He had sacrificed the innocent bird to win. He had paid the price. Court wiped the blood from his eyes, staring at the boy. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly sad, and a little bit proud. "You have beaten me, gunslinger," Court whispered, his voice weak. Roland did not smile. He did not feel victory. He dropped the wooden staff in the dirt, turning his back on his broken teacher and his dead hawk. He walked away, his boots crunching loudly on the dry earth. That night, in the great hall of the castle, the ceremony was held. The air was thick with the smell of burning torches and the rich, heavy scent of sandalwood. The room was silent. No one spoke. Stephen Deschain stood at the head of the hall, looking older and more tired than ever. He looked at his son, seeing the cold, hardened killer that had replaced the boy he knew just that morning. Stephen opened a heavy wooden box to present Roland with his first official weapons, a pair of plain, heavy-caliber apprentice revolvers with steel frames and simple, non-sandalwood grips. The legendary sandalwood-gripped revolvers of the line of Eld still belonged to Stephen. Roland would not inherit those massive Excalibur-forged weapons until much later, after his father's death. For now, Stephen lifted the apprentice gun belts, stepped down from the dais, and strapped them around Roland's waist. Roland felt the weight of the metal settle against his hips. It was a cold, unforgiving weight. It anchored him to the ground. It anchored him to his duty. As he rested his hands on the smooth sandalwood grips, he realized that he could never take them off. He was no longer a boy. He was a gunslinger. He was a weapon of the white, an instrument of fate. He had passed the test, but the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. He had lost his mother to the dark magic of Martin Broadcloak. He had lost his innocence in the shadow of the gallows where hacks hung. He had sacrificed his hawk, David, to defeat his teacher. He had given up every soft, warm thing in his life in exchange for the cold steel of the guns. Roland had his guns, but the real nightmare hadn't even begun. The gunslingers knew that keeping a volatile, newly crowned gunslinger in the castle with the man who slept with his mother was a recipe for disaster. To keep him safe from Martin's wrath, and to get him away from the boiling tension of Gilead, his father ships him away to a quiet seaside town called Megis. It's there, on a moonlit dirt road smelling of salt and dry grass, he's going to meet a girl named Susan, and ultimately light a fire that will burn his soul to ash. Chapter 2. The Ashes of Megis. The world of Gilead felt like a fading dream, a cold nightmare of stone and betrayal left far behind in the dust. Following the horrific events that forced a 14-year-old Roland Deschain to earn his guns through blood and sacrifice, his father, Stephen, made a calculated decision. He knew the boy was volatile. He knew Martin Broadcloak, the dark sorcerer who had seduced the king's wife and poisoned the court, would not stop until the young heir was dead. To protect his son, and to remove a dangerous spark from a powder keg of political tension, Stephen sent Roland and his two closest friends, Cuthbert Allgood and Alan Johns, far away. Their destination was an outer barony called Megis. The transition from the rigid, high-towered stronghold of Gilead to the coastal expanse of Megis was a profound shock to the senses. Gilead smelled of cold stone, ancient parchment, and the sharp tang of ozone from the training yards. Megis was an explosion of life and warmth. The air here carried the heavy, rich scent of the clean sea, mixing with the dry, baked smell of tall grass and horse sweat. Megis was renowned for its vast horse ranches, and the ambient noise of the barony was a constant symphony of whinnying mares, the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed dirt, and the crashing of ocean waves against the southern cliffs. The three boys traveled under false names to hide their true identities. Roland became Will Dearborn. Cuthbert took the name Arthur Heath, and Alain became Richard Stockworth. They posed as simple counters and drovers, sent by the affiliation to inventory the local herds. They traded their heavy aristocratic clothes for rough-spun shirts, dusty boots, and wide-brimmed hats that cast deep shadows over their young, hardened faces. For the first few weeks, the ruse held. The town of Hambry, the capital of Megis, seemed like a peaceful, sleepy backwater. The townsfolk were simple people, their days ruled by the rising and setting of the sun, the tides and the seasonal harvests. It felt like a place where a fractured boy could heal. It felt like a place where the crushing weight of Arthur Eld's legacy might finally slip from his shoulders. But Midworld is a place that has moved on, and a gunslinger carries a storm with him wherever he goes. Peace is an illusion, a thin sheet of glass waiting to shatter. The first crack in that glass appeared in the form of a girl. Her name was Susan Delgado. She was 16 years old, with bright grey eyes and thick golden hair that tumbled down her back like spun sunlight. She possessed a wild, untamed spirit, having grown up as a tomboy following her father, Pat Delgado, around the horse ranches before his suspicious death. She smelled of fresh jasmine, clean cotton, and the faint, earthy dust of the trails she loved to ride. Roland first saw her on a moonlit dirt road outside of town. The night was thick and quiet. the only sound the gentle rustling of the bad grass in the warm wind. The moment their eyes met, a cosmic gear shifted in the universe. It was an immediate, terrifying connection. For Roland, a boy who had just watched his mother betray his father, and who had sacrificed his beloved hawk to secure a tool of death, Susan represented something alien. She represented pure, untainted life. She represented a future that did not involve blood, duty, and the cold weight of the sandalwood guns on his hips. However, Susan's life was already caught in a web of cruel politics and dark intentions. Following her father's death, she lived with her bitter, manipulative aunt, Cordelia. To secure their financial future and remain on their land, Cordelia had struck a vile bargain. She promised Susan to the mayor of Hambry, Hart Thorin, an older man whose wife was barren. Susan was contracted to become his concubine, his gilly, meant to bear him an heir. The night Roland met her on that dusty road, Susan was returning from a humiliating ordeal. To finalize the arrangement with the mayor, Susan had to prove her purity. She was forced to visit a woman named Rhea of the Xyos. If Susan Delgado was the light of Mehis, Rhea of the Xyos was the festering, rotting dark. Xyos Hill loomed over the barony like a cancerous growth. The air around the hill was stagnant, thick with the smell of decay. At the top sat Rhea's hut. Rhea was an ancient, grotesque hermit witch. Her physical appearance was a nightmare made flesh. She possessed only a few rotting teeth. Her skin was a landscape of deep, dirty wrinkles, and her eyes burned with a manic, hateful intelligence. She smelled of stale urine, swamp water, and rotting meat. She kept mutated, disturbing pets and lived in absolute filth. Rhea possessed a deep, festering hatred for anything beautiful, young, or pure. When she examined Susan, checking the girl's honesty, her rough, dirty hands and cruel words left Susan feeling violated and dirty. But Rhea was not just a hateful old woman. She was the guardian of something far more dangerous than anything else in Mehis. A group of dangerous men known as the Big Coffin Hunters, led by a failed gunslinger named Eldred Jonas, had arrived in town. They were secretly working for John Farson, the rebel leader trying to tear down Gilead. They needed a place to hide a terrifying artifact, and they chose Rhea's hut. They gave the witch Merlin's grapefruit. The grapefruit was one of the 13 bends of the bow, ancient magical seeing spheres created in the deep forgotten past. This specific glass was the pink bend. It was not just a tool, it was a sentient, malevolent entity. It looked like a pulsing pink glass sphere, glowing with an unnatural, sickly internal light. When you stood near it, the air felt unnaturally warm, almost feverish. The glass emitted a low, hypnotic humming sound that vibrated not in the ears, but directly in the teeth and the bones. The pink light it cast created long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The grapefruit was a parasite. It fed on negative emotions, fear, anger, jealousy, and obsession. It offered the user the ability to see across vast distances, to spy on enemies, and to glimpse the future. But the price was sanity. The glass whispered to the mind, corrupting thoughts, twisting desires, and turning the user into a hollow vessel of paranoia. Rhea of the Chaos became hopelessly addicted to the pink bend. She spent hours staring into its warm, pink depths, her mind warping further into madness. And through the glass, she began to spy on the town of Hambry. She spied on the mayor. She spied on the Big Coffin Hunters. Most importantly, she spied on Susan Delgado and the young stranger named Will Dearborn. Despite the terrible danger, despite the contract with the mayor, and despite the strict code of the gunslingers, Roland and Susan fell in love. It was a fierce, consuming passion. They began meeting in secret, hiding in the tall grass, stealing moments under the cover of night. For Roland, the touch of Susan's skin, the smell of jasmine in her hair, and the sound of her laughter became an intoxicating drug. For the first time in his life, The cold, rigid discipline drilled into him by court melted away. He allowed himself to feel human. This fractured his relationship with his quartet. Cuthbert, his oldest and most loyal friend, saw the danger. Cuthbert smelled the tension in the air. He knew that Roland's distraction was a death sentence for all of them. They were deep in enemy territory. They had discovered that the seemingly peaceful barony of Megis was actually a massive supply depot for John Farson's rebellion. The town leaders, including Chancellor Kimber Reimer, were secretly refining oil from the nearby Sitgo fields to power the good man's war machines. Cuthbert confronted Roland, his voice sharp with fear and anger. He begged Roland to remember his duty, to remember Gilead, to remember the mission. The arguments turned bitter, nearly coming to blows. The fellowship, the sacred bond of the quartet, began to crack under the weight of Roland's forbidden romance. But the true tragedy of Roland Deschain is not just that he loves, it is the cosmic force that always stands in opposition to that love. The existence of the Pink Bend, Merlin's grapefruit, created a gravitational pull that Roland's soul could not resist. Through a complex series of events, the grapefruit fell into Roland's orbit. The moment he laid eyes on the pulsing pink sphere, a dormant sickness awakened inside him. The glass called to him. It hummed a song that bypassed his ears and echoed in his very soul. When Roland looked into the grapefruit, it did not just show him the movements of his enemies or the betrayal of the town. The malevolent magic inside the sphere reached deep into his mind, found the absolute core of his being, and twisted it. The glass showed him a vision that shattered his reality. It showed him the Dark Tower. The Dark Tower is the linchpin of existence, the cosmic axle around which all universes, all dimensions, and all timelines spin. It is a towering structure of dark stone, standing in a field of red roses, holding reality together. The grapefruit showed Roland that the tower was sick. It showed him that the beams supporting it were breaking, and that if the tower fell, all of creation would dissolve into a chaotic, howling void. The moment Roland saw the tower in the pink glass, a toxic, permanent obsession took root in his mind. The love he felt for Susan was genuine, powerful, and real. But the vision of the tower was something else entirely. It was a divine mandate. It was a crushing, inescapable fate. The grapefruit infected him with a cosmic ambition that dwarfed simple human connection. The trap in Megis finally sprang shut as reaping day approached. The autumn air grew crisp, the leaves turning the color of dried blood. The town prepared for the harvest festival, a time of celebration that masked a dark, ancient undercurrent of violence. Eldred Jonas and the big coffin hunters executed their plan. They murdered the mayor and framed the 3 young boys from Gilead for the crime. Roland, Cuthbert, and Alain were arrested, stripped of their weapons, and thrown into the dark, damp cells of the local jail. The smell of rust, unwashed bodies, and despair filled the small stone room. The town, whipped into a frenzy by the lies of the coffin hunters and the manipulations of Chancellor Reimer, demanded their execution. Susan Delgado, proving her immense courage and her absolute devotion to Roland, refused to let him die. She knew the truth. She knew the boys were innocent, and she knew the town elite were traitors working for Farson. In a desperate, heroic move, Susan broke into the sheriff's office. She managed to secure Roland's plain-gripped revolvers. The weapons were heavy in her delicate hands, the cold steel smelling of gun oil and impending violence. When Deputy Dave Hollis tried to stop her, Susan made the ultimate choice. She pulled the heavy triggers. The deafening roar of the guns in the confined space shattered the quiet of the town. She killed the young deputy, freeing Roland, Cuthbert, and Alain from their cells. The escape was a chaotic blur of noise, smoke, and panic. The boys retrieved their weapons, their horses, and prepared to fight their way out of Megis. They had to stop the oil from reaching Farson's troops. They had to complete their mission. In the chaos, they formulated a plan. The boys would ride toward the oil fields, drawing the big coffin hunters and the rebel forces away, utilizing the treacherous geography of the Eyebolt Canyon and a monstrous dimensional tear known as a thinny to destroy their enemies. Susan was supposed to hide, to stay out of sight until the battle was won, and then they would ride away together. They promised each other a life beyond the dust and the blood. But Ka, the mid-world concept of fate, is a wheel, and it crushes everyone who stands in its path. While Roland and his friends rode into battle, engaging in a brilliant tactical slaughter that wiped out the big coffin hunters and destroyed the oil reserves, Susan was left exposed. The witch, Rhea of the Chaos, furious over the loss of the grapefruit and driven entirely mad by its residual poison, used her dark influence. She allied with Susan's own aunt, Cordelia. Cordelia hated Susan. She hated the girl for ruining the financial arrangement with the mayor, and she hated her for bringing scandal to their family name by sleeping with the young stranger. Together, the witch and the aunt incited the townspeople. They took the fear, the anger, and the paranoia of the town and molded it into a weapon. They branded Susan a traitor. They branded her a whore and a murderer. A mob formed. Normal people, farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, twisted into a mindless, bloodthirsty collective. The air filled with the sounds of angry shouts, the stomping of boots, and the clinking of pitchforks and torches. They hunted Susan down. They found her hiding, terrified and alone. They dragged her from her sanctuary, her golden hair tangled, her face bruised by rough hands. They did not just plan to execute her. They planned to revive a dark, ancient, barbaric ritual. The ritual of the Charyu tree. Charyu tree translates to come, reap. It was a sacrificial burning meant to ensure a good harvest, a remnant of the brutal old people that the affiliation had tried to outlaw centuries ago. The mob dragged Susan to the center of town. They built a massive pile of dry wood, old brush, and cornstalks. The smell of the dry timber was heavy in the air, a terrifying promise of the heat to come. They tied Susan to a thick wooden post in the center of the pyre. The ropes cut deep into her wrists and ankles. She was terrified, crying, screaming for Roland to come and save her. The tragedy was compounded by a secret she carried within her. She was pregnant with Roland's child. She carried the heir of Gilead, a tiny spark of life in a world plunging into darkness. The mob surrounded the pyre. The chanting began. It was a low, rhythmic, terrifying sound that vibrated the ground. Charyu tree, come reap! Charyu tree, come reap! The torches flared in the twilight, casting dancing, demonic shadows on the faces of the townspeople. Cordelia Delgado stood at the front, her face twisted in a mask of bitter, righteous fury. The torches were thrown. The dry wood caught instantly. The fire roared to life with a sound like a rushing wind. The heat was immediate and punishing, pushing the mob back. The smell of burning wood, dry leaves, and eventually, the horrifying scent of burning hair and scorching flesh filled the air. Where was Roland? The classic hero trope demands that the knight rides in at the last second, guns blazing, to cut the ropes and carry the maiden to safety. But Roland Deschain is not a classic hero. He is a tragic figure, broken by his own destiny. Roland was miles away. He had won his battle. The enemy was destroyed. But instead of rushing back to town to find Susan, he was incapacitated. He was trapped. He had looked into Merlin's grapefruit again. The pink glass had him in its grip. The malevolent magic flooded his mind, paralyzing his body. The world around him faded away, replaced by the hypnotic, swarming pink light of the sphere. The grapefruit did not want him to save her. It wanted to feed. It wanted to consume the absolute peak of his agony. Through the twisted, magical connection of the glass, the grapefruit forced Roland to watch. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the pulsing pink sphere, feeling the unnatural warmth radiating from the glass. Inside his mind, he was transported to the town square. He felt the punishing heat of the flames. He smelled the suffocating smoke. He heard the rhythmic, maddening chant of the mob. And he saw Susan. He saw the flames lick up her body. He heard her horrific, agonizing screams piercing the night. He heard her call his name, over and over again, a desperate plea for a savior who would never arrive. Roland, Roland, I love thee. He watched the golden hair turn to ash. He watched the light die in her beautiful grey eyes. He felt the life of his unborn child extinguish in the roaring inferno. The grapefruit drank his despair like a starving beast. The psychic link forced Roland to experience the visceral, physical horror of her death. His soul fractured into a million jagged pieces. The grief was so profound, so absolute, that it effectively killed the boy he was. When the vision finally ended, and the pink light faded back to a dull throb, Roland collapsed into a deep, catatonic state. He remained unresponsive for days. Cuthbert and Alain, horrified by what had happened and heartbroken for their friend, had to build a travois, a wooden sled, to drag Roland's unresponsive body away from the ashes of Megis, beginning the long, grim journey back toward Gilead. Roland survived, but the man who eventually woke up from that catatonic state was entirely different. The fire that consumed Susan Delgado at the Charyu tree burned away the last remnants of Roland's humanity. It burned away his capacity for simple, uncomplicated love. The trauma forged a psychological armor so thick, so cold, that nothing could ever truly penetrate it again. He accepted a grim, terrible truth. His love was a curse. Anyone who stood close to him, anyone who shared his path, would eventually be consumed by the fire of his destiny. He internalized the guilt, locking it away in a dark, untouchable vault in his mind. But worst of all, the event cemented his tragic flaw. When forced to choose between the warmth of a human heart and the cold, terrifying allure of the mystical artifacts pointing toward the Dark Tower, his soul was forever bound to the tower. The grapefruit had won. It had shown him that human lives are fleeting, fragile things that burn away to ash, while the tower stands eternal. He carries the sickening smell of that smoke back to Gilead, his heart permanently turned to stone, buried deep within a catatonic shell. But the pink glass wasn't done destroying his family. The grapefruit is a hungry, malevolent force, and when Roland finally opens his eyes and returns to the stone halls of his ancestral home, the glass is going to trick his shattered mind one last time and make him pull the trigger on the one person he was supposed to protect above all others. Chapter 3. The Fall of Gilead and the Blood of Jericho Hill. The wooden runners of the sled scraped over the hard dirt track. That sound became the only rhythm in a dead world. For weeks, the journey back from the seaside barony of Megis was nothing but dust, blistering heat, and absolute silence. Roland Deschain lay on the rough wooden frame dragged behind a horse. He did not speak. He did not eat unless forced. He kept his eyes open, staring at the blinding white sky, but he saw nothing but flames. The smell of the Charyu tree pyre clung to his clothes and his skin. He breathed in the scent of burning wood and scorched hair with every intake of air. His mind was a locked fortress, and the boy inside was gone, reduced to a pile of grey ash. Cuthbert Allgood and Alain Johns rode beside him, their young faces hardened by the violence they had survived. They offered no words of comfort because no comfort existed. They had seen the angry mob. They had seen Susan Delgado burn. They understood that the world possessed a cruel, unyielding nature. Their mission was complete. They had stopped the rebel John Farson from securing the oil of Megis. But the victory felt like a rotting corpse left in the sun. The affiliation was still crumbling, and their best friend was a hollow shell. When the high stone towers of Gilead finally broke the horizon, the sight offered no relief. The ancient city, the heart of the gunslingers, had changed. The air no longer smelled of clean rain and sweet sandalwood. The wind carried a foul, stale scent, like old iron and damp cellars. The colourful banners of the affiliation hung in tatters from the high spires, ripped by relentless storms. The great gates of the city, forged from heavy oak and black iron, stood guarded by men with tired, hollow eyes. The tension inside the castle walls was a physical weight. You could feel it pressing against your chest, making every breath an effort. The political rot had spread deep. John Farson's influence crept into the minds of the outer baronies, turning common farmers into fanatics. But a far worse poison festered inside the royal chambers. Martin Broadcloak, the dark sorcerer, had fled. His affair with Roland's mother, Gabrielle Deschain, was common knowledge. The betrayal fractured the royal court. Stephen Deschain, Roland's father, maintained his iron grip on the military, but his heart carried a deep, bleeding wound. He treated his wife with a cold, distant courtesy. The warmth of their family was dead. Gabrielle Deschain lived in a state of suffocating guilt. She remained in the castle, a ghost wandering the quiet, shadowed corridors. She smelled of her signature rose perfume, but the scent had turned sour, masking the stench of her deep shame. She knew she had brought ruin to her family. She knew the dark magic of Martin had twisted her mind, but the choices she made were her own. Desperate to find some sliver of redemption, she decided to make a peace offering to the son she had betrayed. She spent her days in her chambers, working with simple, colourful threads. She wove a custom hand-woven belt for Roland. She poured her sorrow into every weave of the fabric. But Roland could not accept her repentance because Roland was no longer living in reality. Despite the catastrophic trauma he suffered in Mages, Roland had kept the cursed artifact. He had brought Merlin's grapefruit back to Gilead. He hid the pink wizard's glass in a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He locked it with an iron key. He knew the sphere was pure evil. He knew the malevolent magic inside the glass fed on his misery, and that it had paralyzed him while Susan burned. The logical, trained mind of the gunslinger screamed at him to throw the glass into the sea, or to bury it deep in the earth. But the grapefruit was an addiction. It was a cosmic parasite hooked into his soul. In the dead of night, when the castle was silent and the stone walls radiated a freezing chill, Roland would wake up. A low, vibrating hum resonated in his teeth and his jaw. The hum called to him. It dragged him from his bed. He would unlock the heavy wooden chest, his hands trembling. The moment he lifted the lid, a sick, pulsing pink light spilled into the dark room. The glass felt unnatural. It was warm, almost feverish to the touch. The pink light cast long, distorted shadows on the stone walls, making the room look like the belly of a dying beast. Roland would stare into the depths of the sphere, losing hours to its hypnotic pull. The glass whispered lies to his mind. It showed him visions of John Farson's approaching armies. It showed him the dark void of the cosmos. Most of all, it showed him the towering black stone spire of the Dark Tower. The tower became his only reason to breathe. The glass convinced him that everyone around him was an enemy, an obstacle standing between him and his cosmic destiny. The grapefruit fueled his paranoia. It took his grief over Susan and twisted it into a sharp, burning rage. The glass needed to feed, and it craved the ultimate tragedy. The night the glass chose to strike, a massive storm battered the high walls of Gilead. Thunder shook the stone foundations. Lightning tore across the sky, casting sudden, harsh bursts of white light through the narrow windows. The air smelled of sharp ozone and impending violence. Roland discovered that the grapefruit had gone missing from his father's safe. He traced the sphere's dark allure to his mother's chambers, finding it resting on a table. The pink light illuminated her room, and as he approached, the hum of the glass roared in his mind. Unknown to Roland, his mother, Gabrielle Deschain, was quietly entering her chambers. She held the finished hand-woven belt in her hands, its material smelling rich and new, woven to a perfect finish. Wearing a simple white gown, she stepped silently across her cold stone floor. She hoped to present this handmade peace offering to her son, hoping it would serve as the first step toward his forgiveness. She entered her bedchamber, stepping quietly toward where her son stood. As Roland peered into the grapefruit, the malevolent force inside the sphere seized control of his mind and hijacked his vision. The pink light flared, projecting a terrifying illusion of danger. In the reflection of the glass, Roland did not see his mother approaching. The grapefruit projected a flawless, terrifying hallucination of the witch, Rhea of the Chaos, sneaking up behind him with a deadly weapon, the ancient, grotesque witch from Megis, the architect of Susan's death. Roland saw her matted, filthy hair. He saw her face, a landscape of deep, dirty wrinkles. He saw her rotten teeth bared in a wicked, triumphant smile. He smelled the overwhelming stench of swamp water, stale urine, and rotting meat pouring from her body. The witch held something in her hands. In Roland's warped vision, it was a weapon, a rusted blade meant to gut him in the dark. The training of court took over. There was no thought. There was no hesitation. Roland moved with lethal, unthinking precision. His hand dropped to his side, his fingers wrapped around the heavy, cold sandalwood grip of his revolver. The metal cleared the holster with a slick whisper. He leveled the long, blue steel barrel at the nightmare approaching him from behind. He pulled the trigger. The roar of the massive gun in the enclosed stone room was apocalyptic. The sound shattered the air, a physical blow that rattled the windows and shook the dust from the ceiling. A foot-long tongue of bright orange flame erupted from the muzzle. The heavy lead slug crossed the room in a fraction of a second. The illusion shattered the moment the bullet left the chamber. The pink light of the grapefruit flickered and died, retreating into the glass. The hum faded into absolute silence. The stench of the witch vanished, replaced by the sharp, burning metallic smell of cordite. White smoke drifted toward the ceiling, stinging his eyes. Roland stood frozen, the heavy gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His mother lay on the cold stone floor. The impact of the heavy bullet had thrown her backward. The new hand-woven belt rested near her outstretched hand. A dark, spreading pool of red blood soaked the front of her white gown. The blood looked black in the dim light. It smelled hot, coppery, and utterly wrong. Gabrielle Deschain did not die upon impact. She lay there, her breath rattling in her chest, a wet, terrible sound. She looked up at her son. Her eyes held no anger, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. She tried to speak, but only a bubble of dark blood escaped her lips. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric of the peace offering she had made. Then, her eyes went blank. The rattling breath stopped. The silence rushed back into the room, heavier than before. Roland dropped the heavy revolver. The metal clattered against the stone floor. He fell to his knees, crawling through the spreading pool of warm blood. He touched her face. The skin was losing its warmth. He looked at the belt. He looked at his own hands, coated in the slick red evidence of his crime. His mind broke. The boy who loved his mother, the boy who rode hawks and laughed in the kitchens, vanished into the void. The grapefruit had won. It had orchestrated the ultimate desecration. By manipulating his grief and his rage, the glass had forced him to murder the woman who gave him life. He picked up the woven belt, staining it with his mother's blood, a physical anchor to his unending guilt. He wore that blood-stained belt for years, a punishing reminder of his failure. The murder of Gabrielle Deschain signaled the true death of Gilead. The execution of a queen by the heir apparent sent shockwaves through the affiliation. The people of Gilead, the common folk who had loved Gabrielle, turned their backs on the gunslingers. Whispers of a curse filled the streets. The trust between the protectors and the protected dissolved into fear and suspicion. Stephen Deschain covered up the true nature of the event, claiming it was an accident born of the dark magic of the glass, but the damage was irreversible. The foundation of their society cracked. From that night forward, the world began to move on at an accelerated, terrifying pace. Years passed, blurring into a long, grinding nightmare of perpetual war. John Farson, the good man, amassed an army of incredible size and horrifying cruelty. Farson did not fight with the honorable codes of chivalry. He used numbers, terror, and machines dragged up from the forgotten past. He employed mutants, grotesque creatures scarred by ancient radiation who fought with reckless savagery. The gunslingers fought back. They were the ultimate warriors, unmatched in skill and tactical brilliance. A single gunslinger could hold a canyon against 100 men, but skill cannot defeat time, and it cannot defeat infinite numbers. The war dragged on. It was a meat grinder. The air over Midworld filled with the constant stench of burning oil, sulfur, and rotting flesh. The clean, crisp winds died, replaced by a stagnant, poisonous haze. The once proud cities of the affiliation fell one by one, reduced to rubble and ash. Roland grew into a hardened, ruthless commander. He locked his emotions away behind a massive, impenetrable wall of discipline. He led his forces with a cold, calculating mind. He fought alongside his remaining quartet, Cuthbert Allgood and Alan Johns. They were men now, their faces scarred, their eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of veterans who had seen too much death. They won many battles, but they were losing the war. The resources of Gilead dwindled, their numbers shrank. The enemy possessed ancient weapons, terrifying machines that spat fire and explosive shells, rendering the gunslingers' revolvers and tactics obsolete. Finally, the enemy reached the gates of Gilead. The city fell in a storm of fire and blood. The great stone towers collapsed, crushing the history of Arthur Eld beneath tons of rubble. The surviving gunslingers, a ragged, bleeding remnant of a once great order, fled into the wilderness. They became a guerrilla force, hunted and desperate. The final chapter of their brotherhood took place on a barren, miserable slope of land known as Jericho Hill. The night before the battle was an exercise in pure misery. The weather itself seemed hostile, allied with the encroaching forces of the Crimson King. A thick, oppressive fog rolled over the landscape, swallowing the hills in a dense grey blanket. The fog was not just mist. It felt heavy, greasy, and cold. A freezing rain began to fall, turning the ground into a treacherous, sucking bog of dark mud. The gunslingers made their camp in the dirt. There were no fires. Fire meant light, and light meant death. They sat in the freezing dark, the rain soaking through their heavy woolen coats, chilling them to the bone. The smell of wet wool, horse sweat, and creeping fear hung in the damp air. They checked their weapons in the dark, the metallic clicks of revolving cylinders offering the only familiar comfort. They knew the good man's army surrounded them. They knew they were vastly outnumbered. They knew they were going to die. Alan Johns possessed a rare gift. The gunslingers called it the touch. It was a form of telepathy, an extrasensory perception that allowed him to sense the emotions and the presence of others. Throughout the war, Alain's gift had saved their lives countless times. He could feel the enemy approaching before anyone heard a sound. But the thick, unnatural fog and the sheer exhaustion of years of constant combat had dulled his mind. The magic of the enemy, the lingering dark influence of the sorcerer Martin Broadcloak, twisted the air, creating static in Alain's perception. Hoping to scout the enemy positions and find a weak point in the encirclement, Alain mounted his horse and rode out into the freezing fog. He slipped into the grey void, leaving Roland and Cuthbert to wait in the agonizing dark. Hours passed. The rain grew heavier, stinging their faces like tiny shards of glass. The mud sucked at their boots. The tension was unbearable. Every rustle of the wind, every snapping branch, sounded like a marching army. Roland and Cuthbert stood back to back, their hands resting on the cold sandalwood grips of their massive revolvers. Their nerves were frayed, stretched to the absolute breaking point. Then they heard it, the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the thick soup of the fog. The rhythm was fast, desperate. A shadow detached itself from the grey wall of mist. The figure rode hard, leaning low over the horse's neck. In the blinding dark and the panic of the moment, the static in the air played a cruel trick. Roland and Cuthbert did not sense their friend. They sensed danger. They assumed it was an enemy scout leading a charge right into their camp. The reaction was instinctual. The years of harsh training overrode conscious thought. Both gunslingers drew their weapons, the heavy metal cleared leather in perfect lethal synchronization. They did not shout a warning. They aimed for the center mass of the approaching shadow. They fired. The twin roars of the heavy revolvers shattered the quiet of the night. Two massive flashes of orange fire cut through the fog, illuminating the falling rain like streaks of gold. The smell of cordite instantly overpowered the scent of the wet earth. The heavy lead slugs found their mark. The rider jerked backward, thrown from the saddle by the sheer kinetic force of the impact. The horse reared up, screaming in panic, and bolted into the dark. The body hit the deep mud with a heavy, wet thud. Silence rushed back, broken only by the steady hiss of the freezing rain. Roland and Cuthbert stepped forward, their guns still raised, their boots sinking deep into the muck. They approached the fallen figure, ready to put a final bullet into the enemy. Cuthbert reached down and grabbed the collar of the heavy woolen coat, hauling the body out of the mud. The grey light of the approaching dawn revealed the horrific truth. It was not an enemy scout. It was Alain Johns, the quiet, thoughtful boy who had stood beside them since childhood. Alain, who had helped build the travois to carry a broken Roland away from Meghis. The two bullets had struck him dead center in the chest, tearing his heart apart. The dark blood flowed freely, mixing with the freezing rain and the mud. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the grey, weeping sky, his face frozen in a mask of shock. He had ridden back to warn them of the enemy's position, and they had murdered him in the dark. Cuthbert fell to his knees in the mud. He let out a ragged, tearing sound, a sob that sounded like an animal dying. He grabbed Alain's cold hands, begging his friend to wake up, begging the universe to reverse the last 10 seconds of time. Roland did not scream. He did not cry. He stood perfectly still, the cold rain washing the mud from his boots. The walls inside his mind grew thicker, colder, and harder. He had shot his mother because of an illusion. He had shot his best friend because of the fog. His guns, the sacred relics of Arthur Eld, were cursed. They brought death to everyone he loved. He internalized this final tragedy, locking it away in the dark vault alongside Susan and Gabrielle. He accepted that he was a destroyer, an instrument of a cruel fate. There was no time to bury their friend. There was no time to mourn. As the grey light of dawn finally broke through the fog, a sound rolled across Jericho Hill. It was a deep, terrifying note, a blast from a crude bone horn. It was the signal. The enemy had arrived. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the scope of their doom. The slopes of Jericho Hill were swarming. Thousands of fastened soldiers, clad in rusted scrap metal and carrying jagged weapons, charged up the muddy incline. Among them were mutants, twisted aberrations of nature that howled like wolves. In the distance, massive ancient cannons, salvaged from the ruins of the old world, aimed their iron snouts at the top of the hill. The surviving gunslingers, numbering less than 100, formed a final circle at the crest of the hill. They drew their massive revolvers. They checked their ammunition. They prepared to die. The battle was a slaughter. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the screams of the dying, and the explosive thunder of the ancient cannons. Cannonballs smashed into the earth, throwing massive geysers of mud and shattered bodies into the air. The smell of blood, Spilled intestines and burning sulfur became a physical barrier, choking the lungs. The ground turned into a slick red swamp. The gunslingers fought like demons. Their hands moved faster than the eye could follow, reloading the heavy cylinders with impossible speed. Every shot found a target, but for every enemy that fell, 10 more rushed forward to take his place. The sheer volume of bodies overwhelmed the defenders. The circle shrank. The gunslingers fell, one by one, their blood soaking the soil of Jericho Hill. In the center of the chaos stood Cuthbert Allgood. Cuthbert had always been the Joker. He was the light-hearted soul of the quartet, the boy who talked to the skull of a bird and found humor in the darkest moments. But on Jericho Hill, there was no humor left. There was only a defiant, blazing rage. Cuthbert had been shot multiple times. Blood poured from wounds in his chest and his legs. His coat was a ragged, ruined mess, but he refused to fall. In his left hand, he held his heavy revolver, firing into the surging crowd. In his right hand, he held a sacred relic, the Horn of Eld. The ancient brass horn had been passed down through generations, originally blown by Arthur Eld himself. It was a symbol of hope, a rallying cry for the forces of the White. Roland had carried the horn for years, but on the eve of the battle, he gave it to Cuthbert. He trusted his best friend to sound the charge, to announce their defiance to the universe. Cuthbert raised the brass horn to his blood-stained lips. He filled his lungs, drawing in the smoke and the stench of death. He blew the Horn of Eld. The sound was pure magic. It cut through the roar of the cannons and the screams of the mutants. It was a clear, ringing brass note that seemed to vibrate the very fabric of reality. For a brief second, the enemy line faltered. The sound carried the weight of thousands of years of history, the unbroken lineage of kings and knights. Cuthbert lowered the horn and laughed. It was a wild, manic sound, a final insult to the overwhelming forces trying to crush them. He fired his gun, dropping a mutant, and raised the horn to blow it again. On a ridge overlooking the battlefield stood a man wrapped in dark robes. He called himself Rudin Filaro, but his true name was Randall Flagg, the man in black. He watched the slaughter with a cold, amused smile. He saw the defiant gunslinger blowing the ancient horn. Flagg picked up a long, heavy yew bow. He knocked a black-fletched arrow, drew the string back to his cheek, and released. The arrow hissed through the air, cutting a perfect path through the smoke and the rain. Cuthbert had the horn raised, his chest expanded for another blast, his mouth open in a defiant laugh. The black arrow struck him directly in the right eye. The sharp steel head pierced his brain, instantly extinguishing his life. The laughter cut off. The brass horn slipped from his fingers. Cuthbert Allgood collapsed backward, falling into the deep red mud, dead before his body hit the ground. The Horn of Eld landed beside him. The ancient brass settled into the muck, rapidly sinking beneath the surface, covered by the dirt and the blood. The symbol of hope was swallowed by the earth. Roland saw his friend fall. The last thread connecting him to his past snapped. Alain was dead by his own hand. Cuthbert was dead in the mud. Gilead was gone. His mother was a corpse in a stone room, and his father was lost. The battle was over. The forces of the good man swarmed over the crest of the hill, butchering the wounded and claiming the ultimate victory. The order of the gunslingers was officially extinct. Roland survived. He used the chaos and the smoke to his advantage. He fell into a pile of the dead, covering himself with the bodies of his fallen brothers. He lay perfectly still in the freezing mud, the smell of fresh corpses pressing against his face. He slowed his breathing, slowing his heart rate, employing the deep meditative trances taught by Court. He played dead while the enemy scavenged the battlefield, taking weapons and boots from the fallen. He lay in the mud for 2 days. He listened to the crows descend, their harsh caws the only sound left on Jericho Hill. When the enemy army finally marched away, leaving the hill to the scavengers, Roland dug himself out from under the rotting bodies. He stood up, a solitary figure in a landscape of absolute devastation. His clothes were soaked in blood and mud. His face was a grim, emotionless mask. He was the last of his kind. He was a ghost trapped in a dying world. He walked over to the spot where Cuthbert had fallen. He looked down at the ruined face of his best friend. He saw the black arrow protruding from his eye. He looked at the mud near Cuthbert's outstretched hand. He saw the faint gleam of ancient brass pushing through the bloody soil. The horn of eld lay there, waiting to be retrieved. It was his birthright. It was the last symbol of his lineage. Retrieving the horn was a crucial act. It signified a commitment to his humanity, a commitment to honor the memories of those who died. Roland stared at the horn for a long time. The wind whipped across the barren hill, bringing the sharp chill of the coming winter. He remembered the pink light of the grapefruit. He remembered the vision of the dark tower. The obsession flared in his mind, cold and bright. The horn was the past. The horn was a piece of metal that belonged to dead men. The tower was the future. The tower was the only thing that mattered. Roland turned away. He left Cuthbert to the crows. He left Alan in the unmarked mud. He left the horn of eld sinking into the dirt of Jericho Hill. He turned his face toward the desolate horizon, his heavy boots making slow, rhythmic thuds on the cursed earth. He began the endless solitary march across the dying wasteland, chasing the man in black. He abandoned his humanity in the mud of Jericho Hill, choosing to become a cold, perfect weapon aimed squarely at the center of the universe. Now a solitary ghost, Roland wanders a dying wasteland for decades. His heart is a sealed vault, and he believes he is immune to the pain of love and loss. But the universe possesses a sick, twisted sense of humor. He is about to stumble upon a new surrogate son in the blistering heat of the desert, only to face the exact same horrific choice: save the innocent boy, or let him fall into the dark to reach the tower. Chapter 4. The Desert, the Boy, and the New Quartet. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. This single reality defined Roland Deschain's existence for decades after the fall of Gilead and the massacre at Jericho Hill. The world had not just moved on, it had dried up, withered and blown away in the wind. The Mohaine Desert was an ocean of cracked hardpan, blinding white dunes and dead devil grass. The heat in this wasteland was not merely a temperature, it was a physical hammer that struck Roland's neck and shoulders from the moment the sun broke the horizon until it sank in a smear of bruised purple. The air held no moisture. It smelled of baked alkali dust, old bones, and the copper tang of his own dried blood inside his cracked nose. Roland walked with a slow, mechanical rhythm. The heavy sandalwood grips of his revolvers slapped against his thighs. His boots ground the dry earth into powder. His mule had died days ago, collapsing in a heap of exhausted, trembling muscle. Roland had taken his water skins, left the animal to the circling buzzards, and continued on foot. He was a man stripped of all extraneous emotion. The grief of losing Susan, his mother, and his oldest friends was locked inside a mental vault. He was no longer a human being navigating a chaotic world. He was a fired bullet traveling toward a single target. He tracked Walter Paddock, the man in black, the dark sorcerer who had orchestrated the destruction of his family. Walter left a trail of cold campfires and mocking signs, pulling the gunslinger deeper into the abyss. The sheer scale of the desert worked on Roland's mind. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered thought. When he finally stumbled upon an ancient, decaying way station, half buried in the sand, it felt like a mirage. The way station was a relic of the old world. Its wooden planks were bleached grey by the sun and warped by the wind. The roof sagged under the weight of decades of accumulated dust. Roland pushed the heavy door open. The interior smelled of dry rot, ancient dust, and sweet curing hay. It was dark, a sudden shocking relief from the blinding glare outside. He moved toward the back, finding an old iron pump. He gripped the rusted iron handle, his muscles protesting as he drove it up and down. At first, nothing happened. Then a thick slurry of rust and mud spat from the spout. Finally, a stream of clear, cold water gushed over his hands. He drank, feeling the cold liquid wash down his parched throat, a shock of pure life in a dead land. As he rested, he realized he was not alone. He heard a scuffling sound from the hayloft. A small figure climbed down the wooden ladder and stepped into the dim light. It was a boy. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and wore strange clothes, a pair of blue jeans and a collared shirt. He looked frail, out of place, and deeply afraid. His name was Jake Chambers. Roland did not immediately embrace the boy. He approached him with the caution of a wild animal. He shared his water and his dried meat. Over the next few days, as Roland regained his strength, the two formed a tentative bond. Roland learned to cook simple meals over a small fire, the smell of roasted corn filling the dusty air of the way station. Jake proved to be quiet, resilient, and observant. He possessed a strange wisdom for an 11-year-old. Roland needed to know where the boy came from. He used a bullet casing from his gun belt, swinging the shiny brass back and forth in the light to hypnotize Jake. Under the trance, Jake's mind opened. He spoke of a place called New York City. He described towering buildings made of glass and steel, paved roads packed with metal carriages, and a statue of a lady holding a torch in the harbor. He lived in a year he called 1977. Then Jake described his own death. He had been walking to school, carrying his books, feeling the chaotic energy of the city around him. He stood at a street corner, waiting for the pedestrian light to change. Out of nowhere, a pair of hands shoved him hard in the back. He stumbled forward into the busy street. He looked up just in time to see the massive chrome grille of a 1976 Cadillac rushing toward him. The impact shattered his body. He died on the hot asphalt, listening to the screams of the crowd. The man who pushed him was Jack Mort, an independent sociopathic serial killer who happened to be dressed as a priest. The man in black merely intercepted Jake's soul after he died, pulling him into mid-world to drop him in the desert as a roadblock for Roland. Hearing this story cracked the thick armor around Roland's heart. He recognized the cruel manipulation of his enemy. He saw a boy who had been ripped from a comfortable life, murdered, and thrown into a living hell just to serve as a pawn in a cosmic chess game. Slowly, against every instinct of self-preservation, Roland began to care for Jake. He taught the boy how to shoot, how to build a fire, and how to survive. When they left the way station to resume the pursuit, they walked together. For the first time in decades, Roland did not feel completely alone. He felt the stirrings of a father's protective love. But Roland was poisoned. The pink light of Merlin's grapefruit had hardwired his soul to the Dark Tower long ago. He could love the boy, but he could never place the boy above the quest. The man in black knew this. He had designed this entire scenario to force Roland to prove his ultimate loyalty. Their journey took them out of the desert and into a jagged, imposing mountain range known as the Cyclopean Mountains. The air turned thin and freezing. The sky transformed from a blazing white to a heavy, bruised grey. They found an entrance carved into the base of the rock, an ancient gaping maw that led down into the dark roots of the earth. Walter had gone this way. They had no choice but to follow. The descent into the mines was a plunge into sensory deprivation. The air inside the mountain was damp, freezing, and heavy. It smelled of wet stone, old rust, and stagnant water. They found a rusted handcar sitting on an old set of iron rails. Roland and Jake climbed aboard, pumping the heavy iron handle up and down, driving themselves deeper into the pitch-black tunnels. The rhythmic squeak and clatter of the metal wheels echoing off the stone walls became the only sound in the dark. As they traveled deeper, the air grew foul. A new scent mixed with the damp stone, a smell of wet, rotting meat and stagnant swamp water. A faint, sickly green luminescence began to pulse in the darkness ahead. They had entered the territory of the slow mutants. These were the remnants of humanity that had retreated underground centuries ago, twisted and deformed by the lingering radiation of ancient wars. In the sickly green light, Roland saw them. They were pale, bloated monstrosities. They lacked eyes, possessing only insectile nodes on their flattened faces. Their bodies had devolved into a knotted mess of slick, wet, tentacular limbs covered in suckers. They shambled toward the tracks, their wet bodies slapping against the stone. Panic seized the dark tunnel. Roland pumped the handcar with a frantic, desperate energy, his muscles burning. Jake helped, throwing his small weight into the iron handle. The slow mutant surged forward, reaching out with glowing green tentacles. One slick, cold appendage slapped across the flat platform of the handcar, gripping the wood. Roland drew his revolver. The heavy blast of the gun in the enclosed tunnel was deafening, a physical shockwave that left their ears ringing. He shot the mutant in its faceless mass, blasting it off the car. They pumped harder, racing the primitive nightmare down the rusted tracks until the green glow faded behind them and the air cleared. They survived the mutants, but the mountain had one final test waiting for them in the dark. The tracks ended at the edge of a massive, bottomless abyss. The chasm was too wide to jump. The darkness below was absolute. Spanning this terrifying drop was a decaying bridge made of rotting wooden planks and rusted iron cables. It looked fragile, ready to crumble into dust at the slightest touch. On the other side of the abyss stood the man in black. Walter Paddock wore a dark, hooded robe. His face was hidden in shadow, but Roland could feel the mocking smile. The sorcerer did not run. He simply stood there, waiting for the gunslinger to make his final choice. Roland stepped onto the bridge. The wood groaned under his heavy boots. The iron cables swayed, grinding against their stone anchors with a high metallic shriek. Jake followed close behind, his small hands gripping the frayed ropes. The wind rushed up from the abyss below, carrying the freezing scent of deep earth and empty space. They made it halfway across. Roland kept his eyes locked on Walter. He was so close. After all the years, all the blood and all the miles, he was finally going to catch his enemy. He was finally going to force the sorcerer to reveal the path to the dark tower. Then a sharp, cracking sound echoed over the chasm. The rotting wood beneath Jake's feet gave way. The plank snapped, dropping the boy into the void. Jake screamed. He managed to catch the rusted iron cable with both hands. He dangled over the bottomless dark, his small body swinging wildly in the freezing wind. Roland stopped. He looked back. He saw the boy clinging to the wire, his knuckles white, his face twisted in pure terror. He saw the surrogate son he had grown to love, hanging on the edge of death. He looked forward. He saw the man in black turning his back, preparing to walk away into the tunnels on the other side. The cosmic scale balanced. The choice presented itself with brutal, uncompromising clarity. If Roland turned back, knelt down, and used his strength to pull Jake up, he would save the boy's life. But doing so would give Walter the time he needed to escape. He would lose the trail. He would lose his only lead on the dark tower. If Roland stepped forward and chased Walter, he would catch his enemy. He would get his answers. But the boy would fall. The toxic poison of Merlin's grapefruit flared in his mind. The tower. The tower was everything. The tower was the axle of the universe. What was the life of one small boy compared to the salvation of all reality? Court's harsh lessons echoed in his ears. A gunslinger does not hesitate. A gunslinger sacrifices everything for the mission. Roland stood paralyzed for an agonizing moment. The wind howled around them. The iron cables groaned. He felt a tearing sensation in his chest, a profound, sickening realization that he was about to commit an unforgivable sin. He loved Jake, but he loved the tower more. He took a step forward, toward the man in black. Jake saw the movement. The boy looked up at the gunslinger. He did not scream for help anymore. He did not beg. He saw the cold, dead light in Roland's eyes. He understood exactly what was happening. He understood that he was just another piece of kindling thrown onto the fire of Roland's obsession. With a tragic, heart-breaking calm, Jake delivered his final words to the man who was supposed to protect him. "Go then," the boy said, his voice carrying over the rushing wind. "There are other worlds than these." Jake let go of the wire. He dropped like a stone. He fell into the absolute darkness below. Roland heard the rushing sound of the boy's descent, followed by a long, terrible silence. There was no sound of impact. The abyss simply swallowed him whole. Roland turned his face forward. He closed his mind, locked away the memory of the falling boy, and sprinted across the remaining planks of the bridge. He reached the other side and caught the man in black. The confrontation that followed was not a physical battle. Walter led Roland into a place he called the Golgotha, an ancient place of skulls and dust. They built a fire. They sat across from each other in the dark, and they spoke. Walter forced Roland to face the terrifying scale of his quest. He showed the gunslinger a vision of the universe. He explained that a single blade of grass in their world contained an entire cosmos within its atoms, and that their universe was nothing more than a blade of grass in a larger field. He introduced the concept of the tower not just as a building, but as the linchpin holding infinite dimensions together. Walter warned him that the quest was madness. He told him that destiny, was a wheel, and that it crushed everyone bound to its rim. During this long, mind-bending conversation, Roland fell into a deep, supernatural sleep induced by Walter's magic. When Roland finally opened his eyes, the world had changed again. He was no longer in the dark Golgotha. He lay on a beach of grey sand. The sky above was a heavy, overcast iron color. The man in black was gone, leaving behind only a pile of dust and white bones next to a dead campfire. Roland realized with a creeping sense of horror that he had not slept for a few hours. The growth of his hair, the decay of his clothes, and the weathering of the bones suggested he had been asleep for a decade, perhaps more. He stood up, his joints popping, his muscles stiff and weak. He heard the rhythmic crashing of heavy waves. He smelled the overwhelming scent of salt, iodine, and rotting kelp. He was on the shore of the Western Sea. The air was cold and damp. The tide was coming in. Roland walked toward the water, his mind still clouded by the supernatural slumber. He needed to wash the dust from his face. He stepped into the surf, feeling the freezing water rush over his boots. He did not notice the creatures moving in the foam until it was too late. They were called lobstrosities. They were nightmare creatures, a foul cross between giant lobsters and scorpions. They were massive, 4 feet long, armored in thick, dark shells, possessing sharp, serrated beaks and eyes mounted on stalks. As they scuttled out of the waves, they clicked their heavy claws together and murmured in bizarre, questioning voices, "Dad-a-chum, dumb-a-chum, dead-a-check, did-a-chick?" The sound was unnerving, like a twisted mockery of human speech. Before Roland could draw his heavy revolvers, one of the lobstrosities lunged out of the crashing surf. Its massive, serrated claw clamped down on Roland's right hand. The pain was explosive. It was a blinding, white-hot agony that ripped through his nervous system. The creature's claws sliced through bone, tendon, and muscle with horrifying ease. Roland screamed, kicking at the armored beast, bringing his left boot down hard on its carapace. The creature hissed, its beak snapping, and retreated back into the foaming water. Roland stumbled backward onto the dry sand, clutching his right hand. Blood poured from the wound, painting the grey sand a stark, bright red. He looked down and realized the catastrophic extent of his injury. The lobstrosity had severed his index and middle fingers. The first 2 digits of his right hand were gone, chewed off at the knuckle. The same monstrous creature also clamped onto his right foot, shearing off most of his big toe straight through the heavy leather boot. For a gunslinger, the loss of those specific fingers was a death sentence. The index and middle fingers were his shooting fingers. The right hand was his primary weapon hand. In a matter of seconds, the beach had stripped him of his greatest skill. He was crippled. Worse, the lobstrosities carried a foul, toxic venom. Almost immediately, Roland felt a burning fire spreading up his right arm. A red line began to track up his veins toward his heart. Sepsis set in with terrifying speed. His body temperature spiked. The grey sky began to spin. He dragged himself away from the surf, the voices of the creatures mocking him from the water. Dadda chum, dumber chum. He was dying. He had survived the fall of Gilead, the war, the desert, and the man in black, only to be killed by mindless scavengers on a desolate beach. He needed medicine. He needed a miracle. As he limped along the shore, driven by pure, stubborn momentum, he saw something impossible standing in the wet sand. It was a door. It was a freestanding wooden door, complete with a frame and a doorknob, standing entirely alone on the beach. There was no wall attached to it. The heavy wood was solid, bearing a carved inscription, "The Prisoner." Roland approached the door. He smelled the salt air, but as he put his face near the wood, he smelled something else. He smelled stale air, cheap cologne, and the sharp tang of aviation fuel. He gripped the knob with his good left hand and turned. The door opened. It did not reveal the beach on the other side. It opened directly into the mind and eyes of a young man sitting on an airplane. The young man was Eddie Dean. The year was 1987. Eddie was flying into New York on a Delta flight, sweating profusely, terrified out of his mind. He was a heroin addict, and he was currently smuggling a massive amount of pure cocaine strapped to his armpits for a dangerous mob boss named Enrico Balazar. Roland stepped through the door, effectively entering Eddie's consciousness. The transition was jarring. The freezing beach vanished, replaced by the cramped, claustrophobic cabin of the airplane. The smell of rotting kelp was replaced by the scent of stale air conditioning, cheap coffee, and Eddie's panicked sweat. Roland saw the world through Eddie's eyes. He felt the gnawing, hollow ache of Eddie's heroin withdrawal pulling at his guts. Eddie was broken. He was a victim of his own addiction, trapped by a ruthless older brother and a violent criminal syndicate. He possessed a sharp, sarcastic wit, using humor as a shield to hide his deep sense of inadequacy. Roland needed Eddie. He needed someone with 2 good hands to help him fight the mobsters waiting on the ground, and he needed Eddie to bring him antibiotics to cure the raging infection spreading from the lobstrosity bites. But more than that, Roland needed a soldier. He needed to replace Cuthbert. He needed to build a new quartet. Using his sheer force of will, Roland forced his consciousness into Eddie's mind. He spoke to the terrified young man, demanding cooperation. In a chaotic, violent blur of gunfights in airport bathrooms and bloody shootouts in Balazar's illegal club, Roland dragged Eddie back through the freestanding door onto the grey beach of Midworld. Eddie hit the sand, convulsing from severe heroin withdrawal. He vomited, shivering violently in the cold wind, cursing Roland with every breath. He was not a gunslinger. He was a junkie from Brooklyn, ripped out of his reality and dropped onto a beach filled with man-eating monsters. But Roland did not care about Eddie's comfort. He fed him, guarded him from the lobstrosities, and forced him to survive the brutal withdrawal process. Slowly, he began to forge the young man into a weapon. Their march up the beach continued. The infection in Roland's blood receded thanks to the medicine Eddie brought, but the damage to his hand was permanent. Days later, they found a second freestanding door in the sand. This one bore the inscription, "The Lady of Shadows." Roland opened the door and stepped into the year 1964. He stepped into the mind of Odetta Holmes. Odetta was a wealthy, educated black woman heavily involved in the civil rights movement. She was shopping in Macy's department store. The air smelled of expensive perfume, polished floors, and the subtle friction of a segregated society. She was highly intelligent, brave, and deeply compassionate. However, she was missing her legs below the knee, having been pushed in front of a subway train years earlier. But the tragedy of her missing legs was nothing compared to the tragedy inside her head. Years before the subway incident, a young Odetta was struck in the head by a heavy brick dropped from a building. The man who dropped the brick and later pushed her in front of the train was Jack Mort, the same sociopath who pushed Jake Chambers into the street. The trauma of the brick fractured Odetta's mind, creating a severe dissociative identity disorder. She shared her body with an alter ego named Detta Walker. If Odetta was cultured, kind, and rational, Detta was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated rage. Detta was vicious, manipulative, violent, and deeply paranoid. She viewed everyone as an enemy and fought with the savagery of a cornered animal. Odetta did not know Detta existed, and Detta despised Odetta. Roland pulled this fractured woman through the door, dragging her wheelchair onto the sandy beach. The transition triggered the alter ego. Detta Walker emerged. The dynamic of the group instantly turned into a nightmare. Detta tried to kill them both. She threw rocks, screamed obscenities, and plotted their murder while they slept. Eddie, who was already struggling with his own traumatic displacement and fresh sobriety, found himself falling in love with the kind Odetta, but constantly fighting for his life against the violent Detta. Roland watched this chaos with a cold, calculating eye. He had successfully drawn his companions. He had a recovering addict from the 80s and a woman from the 60s with a fractured mind and missing legs. They were damaged, broken people. But Roland saw their potential. He saw the latent steel in Eddie's spine and the terrifying raw power in Detta's survival instinct. He knew he had to forge them together. He knew he had to heal Odetta's mind by forcing the two personalities to confront each other, a violent psychological collision that would eventually merge them into a single, incredibly strong woman named Susanna Dean. He was building a new family. He was replacing the friends he had buried in the mud of Jericho Hill. He taught them how to shoot. He taught them the high speech of Midworld. He bound their destinies to his own. He thinks he has finally built a new family strong enough to conquer the wasteland and claim the Dark Tower. But as they march closer to the cosmic center of all realities, crossing ruined cities and facing down ancient cyborgs, Roland fails to realize a grim truth. He hasn't found companions to share his victory. He has simply gathered fresh kindling for the universe's ultimate, devastating fire. Chapter 5. The Crimson King, the Dark Tower, and the Cruelest Wheel. The path to the end of the universe is paved with the bones of those who care for the gunslinger. Roland Deschain gathered a new family, a new quartet, dragging them from their own worlds into his nightmare. He forged Eddie Dean, Susanna Dean, and Jake Chambers into weapons of the white. They followed the path of the beam, a psychic, invisible line of energy holding all realities together. You could feel the beam in your head. It possessed a vibration, a low, constant hum that rattled the teeth and settled deep in the marrow of the bones. The air around the path smelled of ozone, copper, and electric roses. But the universe demanded a toll for every step they took toward the Dark Tower. The Crimson King, the mad god orchestrating the destruction of existence, threw endless horrors into their path. The systematic destruction of Roland's second family began in a place that smelled of roasted meat and old blood. Before the final push into the wastelands, the quartet faced a horrific ambush in New York City. The location was the Dixie Pig, a dark, hidden restaurant serving a clientele of monsters. The air inside the Dixie Pig was thick, choking the lungs with the scent of cooking human flesh and stale wine. Low men in yellow coats and Type 1 vampires swarmed the shadows. These vampires were ancient, possessing rows of needle-sharp teeth and dead black eyes. Father Donald Callahan, a disgraced priest from the doomed town of Salem's Lot, had joined Roland's group. Callahan carried the deep, heavy guilt of his past cowardice. In the neon-lit gloom of the Dixie Pig, surrounded by hundreds of bloodthirsty creatures, the old priest made his stand. He held a simple wooden cross. The vampires recoiled, hissing, their skin burning under the divine light. Callahan ordered Jake to run. He ordered the boy to survive. Knowing he could not fight them all, and knowing the horrific fate of becoming a vampire himself, Callahan placed the cold steel barrel of a revolver under his own chin. He pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the restaurant, an ultimate sacrifice written in blood and smoke. Callahan paid the price so the boy could escape. The loss of the priest was a heavy blow, but the true shattering of the quartet occurred deep in Endworld. The group reached a secret compound known as Algul Ciento, or Blue Heaven. This was the prison where the Crimson King kept the Breakers. The Breakers were psychics, telepaths, and telekinetics harvested from across infinite dimensions. The Crimson King forced them to use their mental powers to chip away at the beams. The air around Algul Ciento felt heavy, thick, with a psychic pressure that gave normal men bleeding noses and splitting headaches. The compound looked like a pleasant, idyllic college campus, complete with manicured green lawns and blue-roofed dormitories. But the guards walking the perimeter were Tahin, grotesque humanoid creatures possessing the heads of birds, rats, and wolves. The warden of this nightmare prison was a human man named Pimley Prentice. Roland knew they had to stop the Breakers. If the beams snapped, the Dark Tower would fall into a void of pure chaos. The quartet launched a coordinated, violent assault on the compound. The Battle of Algul Ciento was a hurricane of noise, fire, and flying lead. The smell of burning buildings and harsh cordite filled the dry air. Explosions shook the earth, throwing massive plumes of dust into the blue sky. Roland, Eddie, Susanna, and Jake moved with lethal precision. Their heavy revolvers roared, dropping the Tahin guards into the dirt. Eddie Dean fought with a fierce, brilliant joy. The former heroin addict from Brooklyn had transformed into a true gunslinger. He fired his weapons, covered his friends, and helped guide the freed Breakers toward safety. The battle turned in their favor. The enemy ranks broke. Victory seemed assured, but war possesses no mercy, and the Dark Tower demands absolute sorrow. In the chaotic aftermath of the firefight, the smoke hung thick and low over the grass. Pimley Prentice lay mortally wounded on the ground, having already been shot in the chest by Roland. Yet with a final, malicious spark of life, the warden slowly dragged his trembling hand to his peacemaker revolver. Eddie Dean stood in the open, momentarily distracted. Pimley raised his gun from the dirt and pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the gunshot cut through the fading noise of the battle, striking Eddie directly above the right eye. Eddie collapsed to the dry earth as Susanna screamed in pure devastation, throwing herself onto his bleeding form. Roland spun and fired again, delivering a final lethal shot that permanently silenced the dying warden. But revenge offered no healing. Eddie lay in the dust, his breathing shallow, wet, and ragged. The light faded from his brown eyes. He tried to speak, spitting a bubble of dark blood over his lips. He looked at the faces of his found family. Within hours, the life drained from his body. The young man from New York died in the dirt of a strange world. Roland felt a massive, invisible weight crush his chest. He had buried his childhood friends at Jericho Hill, and now the cycle repeated. The wheel of fate crushed another soul he dared to love. They dug a grave in the hard earth. They placed Eddie in the dark soil. The smell of the turned dirt was a bitter reminder of their mortality. The quartet was broken, but the beam still called. The tower still waited. The universe, hungry for more pain, shifted the battlefield back to the world of the creators. Roland and Jake used a magical door to cross dimensions, stepping onto a rural highway in the state of Maine. The year was 1999. The summer heat radiating from the asphalt was oppressive. The air smelled of melting tar, crushed pine needles, and sweet grass. They had a specific, vital mission. They had to save the life of their creator, a writer named Stephen King. The psychic vibrations of the universe warned them that the writer was about to die, and if the writer died, the story of the Dark Tower would end, causing reality to unravel. Roland and Jake walked down the shoulder of Route 5. The sun beat down on their shoulders. In the distance, they saw the writer walking along the road, his head buried in a book. At the same time, a blue minivan crested the hill. The driver was a man named Brian Smith. Smith was reckless, his mind clouded. He was not watching the road. He was looking down at the floorboards, trying to wrestle a package of raw hamburger meat away from his pet Rottweiler Bullet. The heavy van drifted off the pavement. The tires crunched onto the gravel shoulder, kicking up a massive cloud of grey dust. The vehicle hurtled forward, a massive block of speeding metal aimed directly at the oblivious writer's back. Roland drew breath to shout, but his aging body, plagued by severe arthritis, betrayed him. His joints locked in a spasm of agonizing pain. He could not move fast enough. Jake Chambers did not hesitate. The young boy, the surrogate son Roland had once let fall into an abyss to chase the man in black, lunged forward. Jake sprinted across the hot asphalt. He shoved his small hands against the writer's waist, throwing Stephen King down into the safety of the ditch. The blue van struck Jake. The sound of the impact was an apocalyptic nightmare. Metal crushed bone with a deafening, sickening crunch. The immense kinetic force threw Jake's small body through the air. He landed hard on the unforgiving pavement, his limbs bent at impossible, horrifying angles. The blue van swerved, smashing into the ditch, the engine hissing a cloud of foul-smelling steam. Roland dropped to his knees on the burning road. The metallic smell of engine coolant mixed with the hot, coppery stench of fresh blood. He crawled to the boy. Jake lay in a massive pool of his own lifeblood. His chest was crushed. His internal organs were ruptured. Boy, the loyal Billy Bumbler, stood over the boy's broken body. The small, raccoon-like creature looked down at his best friend. Boy whined, a high, desperate sound. The creature opened his mouth and spoke the boy's name through his grief. "Ake! Ake!" Jake looked up at the gunslinger. The boy's face was pale, painted with dark red streaks. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle. He reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand. Roland took the small hand in his own, feeling the fading warmth of the boy's skin. The vault inside Roland's mind, the fortress where he locked away his emotions, cracked wide open. He wept. The tears carved clean tracks through the dirt and sweat on his weathered face. Jake died on the hot pavement of Route 5. Roland held the lifeless body, the silence of the summer afternoon pressing down on him like a physical weight. The universe had forced him to sacrifice the boy once in the dark, and now it forced him to watch the boy die again in the blinding light. The tower demanded blood, and it drank the blood of children. Roland buried his son in the woods. He left Maine behind, returning to the desolate wastelands of Endworld, with only Susanna and the grieving Billy Bumbler, Oi. The landscape turned hostile. The air grew freezing. The sky transformed into a flat, bruised sheet of grey iron. They entered the white lands of Empathica, a region blanketed in deep, relentless snow. The freezing wind howled across the white dunes, biting into their exposed skin. Susanna, mourning her husband Eddie, pushed her wheelchair through the drifts. her arms screaming with exhaustion. The cold seeped into their bones, smelling of frost and dead earth. In the middle of this freezing wasteland, they found a small, strange house. The occupant called himself Joe Collins, but his true identity was a monster named Dandolo. Dandolo was a psychic vampire, a creature related to the cosmic horror known as Pennywise. Dandolo did not drink blood. He fed on human emotion. He invited the freezing travelers into his warm home, offering them hot tea and shelter. The air inside smelled of roasting meat and deceptive comfort. Dandolo told jokes, trying to force Roland and Susanna to laugh. He planned to feed on their amusement until their hearts stopped beating. A psychic warning from the writer Stephen King alerted Susanna to the danger. She realized the kindly old man was a monster. She drew her heavy revolver and shot Dandolo dead. The creature's body dissolved into a grotesque insectile mess on the floor. While searching the house, they discovered a hidden door leading down into a dark, damp basement. The air below smelled of mold, human waste, and profound misery. Locked in a small, iron-barred cell, they found a young boy. His name was Patrick Danville. Patrick was a prisoner. Dandolo had kept him in the dark for years, feeding on the boy's terror. To prevent the boy from crying out, the monster had brutally ripped out Patrick's tongue. Patrick was entirely mute, his throat a scarred mass of ruined flesh. But Patrick possessed a terrifying cosmic power. He was an artist. When Patrick drew a picture on a sketch pad, the drawing manifested in reality. When he erased a drawing, the object ceased to exist. Roland and Susanna freed the mute boy, bringing him up into the cold light. Patrick became the final strange addition to their dwindling group. But Susanna Dean could not continue. The loss of Eddie broke her spirit. The death of Jake shattered her resolve. She looked at the towering black spire of the dark tower looming on the distant horizon, and she felt nothing but cold ashes in her heart. She realized the tower was Roland's obsession, not hers. If she stayed on the path, she would die in the snow. She handed Patrick a sketch pad and a pencil. Through gestures and psychic communication, she asked the mute artist to draw a specific door. Patrick touched the lead to the rough paper. He drew a freestanding wooden frame, a heavy door, and a brass knob. He poured his supernatural talent into the graphite lines. As he finished the sketch, the air in the freezing wasteland shimmered. The smell of cold ozone filled the air. A physical door materialized in the snow. It was the unfound door. Susanna turned the brass knob. The heavy wood swung open. The air spilling out of the doorway did not smell of snow and death. It smelled of hot pretzels, exhaust fumes, and the electric hum of New York City. She knew that on the other side of this portal, in an alternate dimension, a version of Eddie and a version of Jake were waiting for her. She could have a second chance at life. She could have a family. She looked at Roland. The old gunslinger stood in the freezing wind, his face an emotionless mask of weathered leather. He did not ask her to stay. He knew he was a poison to those who loved him. He nodded his head, a silent farewell. Susanna wheeled her chair through the unfound door. The heavy wood slammed shut behind her and the portal vanished into the blowing snow. Roland was left with a mute boy and a small, furry animal. The massive, crushing weight of utter solitude settled on his shoulders. The final obstacle standing between Roland and the tower was his own flesh and blood. A monster stalked them through the freezing night. His name was Mordred Deschain. Mordred was an abomination, a creature born of dark cosmic magic. He possessed 2 white parents, Roland and Susanna, and 2 red parents, the Crimson King and the demon Mia. He was a shapeshifter, capable of appearing as a young, starving human boy with bright blue eyes, or transforming into a massive, terrifying were-spider. When he shifted forms, his skin flashed a sickening red, and his eyes turned completely black. Mordred carried a constant, burning hunger. He had already committed atrocities on his march toward the tower. He had ambushed the man in black, Walter Paddock. Using his spider form, Mordred had forced the dark sorcerer to tear out his own organs, eating the villain alive in a display of supreme gore and cruelty. But the harsh wasteland offered no mercy to the monster. Starving and freezing, Mordred had eaten the tainted flesh of a dead horse, poisoning his own system. Sick, desperate, and driven by the psychic commands of the Crimson King, Mordred crept into Roland's camp under the cover of utter darkness. The campfire had burned down to glowing red embers. The air smelled of wood smoke and biting frost. Roland slept, his body exhausted by the endless miles. Patrick slept nearby. Mordred shifted into his spider form. The creature was huge, its body covered in coarse dark hairs. Its multiple black eyes reflected the dying light of the coals. Its massive mandibles dripped with a foul, acidic venom that smelled of rotten meat and ammonia. The spider moved on silent, clicking legs, creeping toward the sleeping gunslinger, ready to deliver a fatal, venomous bite. But Oi was awake. The brave little Billy Bumbler sensed the approaching evil. He smelled the foul stench of the spider. Oi did not possess the size or the strength to fight a monster, but he possessed the heart of a giant. He possessed the unbreakable loyalty of the quartet. Oi let out a vicious snarl and launched his small, furry body directly at the massive spider. The collision jolted Roland awake. The gunslinger opened his eyes to a nightmare of thrashing limbs and snapping jaws. Oi bit deep into the spider's hairy leg, his teeth locking tight. Mordred shrieked, a terrifying, unnatural sound that echoed over the snow. The massive spider turned its fury on the small animal. Mordred struck. The heavy, venomous mandibles clamped down on Oi's spine. The spider violently threw the small animal through the freezing air. Oi let out a high, agonizing squeal as his body landed, brutally impaled on a sharp, broken tree branch. The distraction gave Roland the crucial seconds he needed. Roland drew his heavy revolver. The ancient sandalwood grips fit perfectly into his maimed hand. He aimed down the long, cold steel barrel. He fired. The roar of the gun shattered the quiet of the night. The heavy lead bullet struck the spider, tearing a massive hole through its thorax. Mordred shrieked again, dropping the broken body of the bumbler. The spider thrashed in the snow, its legs curling inward as death claimed it. The heir of the Crimson King died bleeding in the cold dirt. Roland dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. He crawled to Oi. The small creature lay in the blood-stained snow. His spine was broken. His golden eyes were dimming. Oi looked up at the man he loved. The bumbler let out one final soft sigh and closed his eyes forever. Roland buried the bravest member of his quartet beneath the frozen earth. He stood over the small mound of dirt, the freezing wind whipping his long coat around his legs. Everyone was gone. The boy, the addict, the priest, the wife and the loyal animal. They had all fed the fires of his destiny. Roland turned his face toward the horizon. He began the final march. The snow eventually melted away, replaced by an endless rolling landscape of vibrant, impossible color. Roland and Patrick Danville reached Cancar no Rey, the vast field of red roses surrounding the Dark Tower. The visual impact was staggering. Millions upon millions of blood-red roses stretched to the horizon, waving gently in a warm, unseen breeze. The air was intoxicating, thick with a sweet, heavy floral perfume that masked the scent of copper and ozone. The sound was overwhelming. The Dark Tower, standing massive and black in the center of the field, emitted a colossal, vibrating hum. It sounded like a choir of billions of voices singing a single, eternal note. The tower was a spire of smooth, dark stone, rising impossibly high into the bruised sky. A single row of spiral windows wound its way up the structure. On a balcony high above the ground, trapped behind an invisible barrier, stood the ultimate enemy. The Crimson King was not a terrifying monster of shadow. He was an old man with a wild white beard wearing a ragged red robe. His eyes burned with a literal bloody red light. Madness had consumed him entirely. He shrieked obscenities, his voice cracking with insane fury. He reached into a wooden box and hurled weapons down at the gunslinger. The weapons were sneeches, small golden spheres that exploded with catastrophic force. Explosions tore through the field of roses. Geysers of red petals and dark earth showered down on Roland and Patrick. Roland knew his bullets could not harm the god. He needed a different weapon. He turned to the mute artist. He handed Patrick the sketchpad and a pink rubber eraser. "Draw him," Roland commanded over the roar of the explosions. Patrick nodded. His hands flew across the paper. He captured the ragged robes, the wild beard, and the twisted, screaming face of the mad god. But a simple graphite drawing lacked the necessary magic. Patrick needed the color of blood. The boy plucked a handful of red rose petals from the ground. He shoved them into his mouth, chewing them into a thick pulp. He motioned to Roland's hand. Roland drew his knife, slicing a shallow cut across his palm. He held his bleeding hand over the boy's cupped palms. Patrick spat the chewed petals into the blood, mixing a dark, viscous red paste. Using his finger, the artist smeared the bloody paste onto the drawing, coloring the Crimson King's burning red eyes. The drawing possessed a sudden, terrible power. The air hummed with shifting reality. "Erase him," Roland said. Patrick pressed the pink rubber eraser to the paper. He rubbed the graphite lines. He erased the king's feet. High on the balcony, the mad god shrieked in sudden, terrified agony as his legs dissolved into mist. Patrick erased the torso. The king's body vanished into the blowing wind. Patrick erased the arms, the head, and the screaming mouth. But the eraser slid uselessly over the wet, bloody paste of the eyes. The Crimson King was gone. He was wiped from existence, leaving behind only a pair of floating, disembodied red eyes, hovering in the dark window of the tower. The threat was neutralized. The mad god was dead. Roland instructed the mute boy to turn back. He told Patrick to find the door and return to his own world. The artist nodded, turning away from the black stone, leaving the gunslinger entirely alone in the field of red flowers. Roland Deschain walked the final steps to the dark tower. The structure radiated immense, crushing power. The black stone felt cold and smooth under his scarred hands. The heavy wooden door at the base of the tower stood closed. Roland drew breath, filling his lungs with the sweet scent of the roses. He spoke the names of his fallen friends aloud, honoring their sacrifice to the stone. He pushed the heavy door open. It swung on silent hinges, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase winding up into the belly of the cosmic axle. Roland stepped inside. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in the dark. He began to climb. The journey up the stairs was a journey through the graveyard of his own soul. Every level of the tower contained a single room. Every room held an artifact from his past. On the first floor, he smelled the sweet, delicate scent of his mother's rose perfume. He saw the silver mirror she used to brush her hair. On the next floor, he smelled the dry grass and salt air of Meji's. He saw a scrap of Susan Delgado's dress. He climbed higher, smelling the harsh cordite of Jericho Hill, the hot asphalt of Maine, and the roasted meat of the Dixie pig. The tower forced him to relive every failure, every death, and every brutal sacrifice he had made in the name of this quest. The stone walls echoed with the ghosts of his quartet. He reached the very top of the stairs. A single wooden door stood before him. It bore an inscription carved into the heavy wood: Roland. This was the end of the journey. He stood before the threshold of God. He expected to find absolute peace. He expected the universe to grant him absolution for the rivers of blood he had spilled. He reached out with his maimed right hand. He turned the brass knob. He pushed the door open. He stepped through the frame. The smell of sweet roses vanished instantly. A blast of blinding white-hot light struck his face. The air turned bone-dry, smelling of baked alkali dust and dead devil grass. The heat hit his shoulders like a physical hammer. Roland stumbled forward, his boots crunching onto cracked hardpan earth. He looked around. The dark tower was gone. The field of roses was gone. He was standing in the Mohane desert. A profound, sickening horror seized his heart. A cosmic vertigo spun his mind. From the blinding white sky above, a voice boomed down. It was the voice of Gan, the voice of the tower itself. Ka is a wheel. The absolute truth crushed him. He had not reached the end of the journey. He had reached the beginning. The tower was not a place of salvation. It was a mechanism of punishment. Because Roland had sacrificed his humanity, because he had chosen the obsession of the stone over the warmth of love, the universe judged him unworthy of rest. The tower caught him in a perpetual, agonizing time loop. He realized he had done this countless times before. He had sacrificed Jake, Susan, Eddie, and Cuthbert over and over again, across hundreds of lifetimes, trapped in an eternal spinning wheel of fate. "No!" Roland screamed, falling to his knees in the burning sand. "Please, no." But the magic of the reset took hold. A heavy, dark fog rolled over his mind. His memories began to dissolve. The faces of his friends faded into mist. The trauma of the tower washed away, leaving his brain wiped clean. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. Roland stood up. His face was a blank, hardened mask. He did not remember the tower. He did not remember the loop. He adjusted his heavy gun belts, preparing to resume the endless chase. But as his hand brushed against his side, his fingers traced a shape in the leather. He looked down. Tied to his belt, gleaming dully in the harsh desert sun, was an ancient brass object, the Horn of Eld. In his previous life, he had abandoned the sacred horn in the bloody mud of Jericho Hill. He had chosen cold duty over honoring his dead friend Cuthbert. But this time, a tiny fraction of the universe had shifted. This time, he possessed the horn. It was a microscopic change in the fabric of reality, a sliver of hope suggesting that he was learning from his failures. The presence of the horn meant that the wheel of Ka was not a closed circle. It was a spiral. It meant that maybe if he loved his friends enough in this new cycle, if he chose his humanity over his dark obsession, this agonizing loop would be his last. He turned his face toward the blinding horizon and resumed his march across the dead sand. Roland Deschain's true tragedy isn't that he constantly loses everyone he loves. It's that his soul is so poisoned by obsession that he voluntarily chooses the dark tower over them every single time, forcing the universe to trap him in a torturous loop until he finally learns what it means to be human. Speaking of twisted obsessions, Roland isn't the only one driven by a dark, unwavering vision. If you want to see how King crafts a truly terrifying mastermind, click the video on your screen right now for Richard Gianelli, the fictional mafia boss connected to everything.